So this is Jews in Theory, a snapshot of theoretical division and a little more at Los Alamos in 1945. So I'm really privileged to have two positions simultaneously, one as the rabbi of a progressive congregation in Santa Fe called Hamakom, and one as the division leader of theoretical division at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And as a result of having two careers and two positions with some responsibility, I've enjoyed exploring some of the early history of the laboratory and of the strong Jewish presence at the laboratory during the Manhattan Project era between 1943 and 1945. Los Alamos didn't really exist as a town until the laboratory was established in early 1943, and it was established as the central research and development facility to produce the first atomic bombs and end World War II. Many of the scientists who were brought to Los Alamos were Jewish, several of those being refugees from Europe, and the overwhelming majority of those had colorful and fascinating life stories. I hope to share some of their stories with you today. So the first individual I want to talk about is J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the director of the laboratory, the scientific director of the laboratory during the Manhattan era. Oppenheimer, or Oppie as he was sometimes called, was a first-generation American. He was born in New York City, and he was the product of a non-observant Ashkenazi Jewish household, and that's probably the dominant theme for Jews who were at the laboratory during the war era, non-observant and largely Ashkenazic. Oppenheimer was the product of a rags-to-riches family, and so he grew up surrounded by all the cultural amenities of a reasonably well-to-do New York Jew. He was a student at the Ethical Culture Society School, and most importantly, for the Los Alamos story, at the age of 18, Oppenheimer was sent to New Mexico to recuperate from colitis. And so he learned to appreciate the beauty of northern New Mexico, and he once said that physics and the desert country were his two great loves. Oppenheimer was a brilliant scientist in his own right, but more importantly, he also had the ability to lead a team of scientists. And somewhat against his will, at the early days of the laboratory, in fact, I think before the laboratory was really established in 1943, Oppenheimer was tasked with coming up with an organizational chart for the laboratory. And he decided to divide the laboratory's activities up into 4 different technical divisions, and then each division was divided into groups, and each group had a specific task. That's actually the structure of the laboratory today. Divisions, technical divisions, divided into groups, each group having a particular capability. We have more than 4 divisions at the laboratory. There's been a multiplication of that over the years. But one of the divisions that Oppenheimer carved out in this first organizational structure was called theoretical division, and that was where all the theorists went. That division is still here today, 74 years later or so, and it's the only division that has remained intact for the entire history of the laboratory. And I'm very proud to be the division leader of theoretical division today, and it's because of its illustrious history that I got interested in this topic of Jews in theoretical division, but I'm going to expand a little bit beyond that after we go through something about theoretical division. Let me just back up a little bit to talk about Oppenheimer because he's the first Jew on my list. He was perhaps, according to Isidore Rabi, who we're going to talk about towards the end of the talk, according to Isidore Rabi, Oppenheimer was overeducated in fields that lay outside scientific tradition particularly in Hindu religion. And as a result, according to Rabi, Oppenheimer always had this feeling that the world was somewhat mysterious. There was somewhat of a mysterious fog surrounding the universe. And as a result, he wasn't as adept at applying what you might call the practical, real-world, crude, hard, theoretical physics methods that the more successful scientists would do. And we're talking about the difference between somebody at 99% of a Nobel Prize winner and somebody at 100%. So Oppenheimer made some important scientific contributions, particularly associated with black holes, which are now common in our lore, but he didn't really have what you might call the hard-driving theoretical approach to physics, because he had this more broad interest, I think, as a result of his upbringing. In fact, another Nobelist, Murray Gell-Mann, who lives here in Santa Fe, he once said about Oppenheimer that Oppenheimer did not have Sitzfleisch. He didn't have sitting flesh. He wasn't able to sort of sit in a chair and do a long calculation and really apply himself over an extended period of time to a particular problem. He didn't have the patience for that. Instead, he had lots of great ideas which he would throw out there, and then other people would run with those ideas. And he was an inspirational leader. That's why I think he was so successful as the leader of the laboratory. He had tremendous influence, but as a scientist, he never quite reached that same upper echelon that some of the other greats achieved. So, in any case, when Oppenheimer set up the laboratory, he thought that theoretical division would be one of the four divisions. The others, in fact, were experimental physics, called P division, chemistry metallurgy, called CM division, and then ordnance engineering, called E division. Those were the four divisions. Oppenheimer, as a theoretical physicist, thought that he would simultaneously lead the laboratory and lead theoretical division. He was told by his friends that was madness. He should not try to do both at the same time. So instead, he selected Hans Bethe to lead theoretical division. And Hans Bethe went on to win the Nobel Prize subsequent to his work at the Los Alamos site during the war. Just as an aside about theoretical division, today we have about 350 employees in theoretical division. They come from all over the world, which is in part in keeping with the original theoretical division approach. And we have we cover the whole breadth of science. At the time during the war, theoretical division had one particular job, which was to calculate the critical mass needed to assemble an atomic bomb. And then later in the war, when it became clear that plutonium would not work as a gun-assembled device, which is a different story altogether, then the decision to make plutonium into a weapon using an implosion scheme was developed, and theoretical division had the job of studying the physics of an implosion. So those were the main tasks of theoretical division. Here you see a roster of theoretical division from just after VE Day. This is May 10th, 1945. And on this roster, you see about 86 different people. They don't have first names, so I've had to do a little bit of detective work from their last name and from their first initial. But when I first came into theoretical division, I looked at this roster. It was on my boss's door, and I thought it was the most intimidating roster I've ever seen. It is populated by all these great names of theoretical science, theoretical physics, who I grew up learning about and reading books about them and reading books by them, and it's a very intimidating roster. There are 4 future Nobel Prize winners on this roster. There's also one spy of importance. Klaus Fuchs is on that roster. But I was struck when I saw this roster by the fact that pretty much everybody who was in a position of responsibility, the division leader, the deputy division leader, a person listed as the consultant, so that was the division office. And then if you look at the groups, there are 6 of the 8 group leaders who I thought were Jewish, and I pulled the string, and indeed I would say that's a pretty accurate statement, that pretty much everybody who had a position of responsibility was Jewish. So that's what prompted me to do the research on this. It turns out that probably about 25% of the people in the division were Jewish. Again, it's a little hard to tell because I don't know who everybody was. 4 future Nobel Prize winners, as I said, all Jewish. The spy, not Jewish. I thought that was a good thing. By the way, the people who were in positions of responsibility were the senior men, and as you know, it's pretty non-egalitarian, as physics was in that era. But senior meant that they were in their mid to late 30s. So that was a senior person. The average age was in the late 20s, I think, for people at Los Alamos during the Manhattan era. In fact, one of the group leaders we're going to look at a little later turned 27 years old the day after this roster was created. So I'm going to talk mostly about these senior individuals, the people with responsibility, the division leader, the deputy division leader, the consultant, and then 6 of the 8 group leaders. I'll talk briefly about each one of them, and then because I wanted to expand this talk to go outside of theoretical division, I'll touch on some of the great scientists who were at the Los Alamos site during the war who were also Jewish but not in theoretical division. So I start this off with Hans Bethe. Hans Bethe, as I said, went on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1967 for his contributions to the theory of nuclear reactions, which had to do with how stars work. He's really one of the important people to figure out what makes a star burn. And Hans Bethe grew up in Europe. He was born in Strasbourg, and that was Germany at the time that he was born in 1906. And with the rise to power of Hitler in 1933, Bethe lost his job as a result of his mother's Jewish heritage. So I believe that his mother may have converted to Christianity at the time she got married, and so technically, you know, we could argue about whether Hans Bethe was Jewish or not. Certainly he never strongly identified with his Judaism in what we would call an operational sense or a practical observance sense, but Hitler certainly considered Bethe to be Jewish, and as a result, Bethe had to flee Europe, and he ended up getting a position at Cornell, where he remained until his death, and his death occurred at the age of not quite 99 years old. So Hans Bethe used to come and visit the laboratory for many, many years after the war, and I had the privilege of hearing him speak on a number of occasions at Los Alamos. But in his 30s, he was selected to be the division leader of theoretical division. And he had I would say, the respect of scientists such that he could well have been the director of the laboratory, but he was born in a foreign country, and not just a foreign country, but an enemy foreign country, and there was no way that the military director of the Manhattan Project, General Groves, would allow the head of the laboratory to be somebody born in Germany. So he became the division leader of theoretical division. He was quite a jolly individual. In fact, I'll just share with you a reminiscence from another person we're going to talk about later, Joe Hirschfelder. Joe Hirschfelder says that Hans Bethe was ingenious in approximating the solution to complicated equations, and unlike Oppenheimer or Niels Bohr, Bethe was a jolly fellow. And Hirschfelder goes on to say, my office was down the hall, and I could always tell when Bethe and Feynman were working together because there would be frequent bursts of guffaws and belly laughs. And whenever there was a comic moving picture in the base theater, you could always tell by the laughter whether Bethe was in the audience. So I think, quite a kindly soul, and certainly the picture that I associate with Hans Bethe, he has a smile on his face, as you might expect. I discovered that in his earlier days, in 1931, before he fled Europe, he published a short paper that was actually a joke, and it got published in a physics journal, and then he had to retract it because it went past the editors and they went ahead and published it, but he was really just poking fun at somebody with his paper, and so he had to go apologize for that later on. So I think he had a wonderful sense of humor. At the beginning of World War II, in this country, Hans Bethe started working on the theory of armor penetration, and as soon as he started doing that, they classified his work, and it made it inaccessible to him. So he was unable to look at his own published results because he was not yet a U.S. citizen at the time when he came to the United States. So very interesting individual, and the leader of theoretical division who helped assemble this tremendous team of scientists during the war. His deputy was an individual whose name was Victor Weisskopf, and known as Vicky to most of his friends, I believe. He also was born in Europe, and born in Vienna in this case, and he was born to a comfortably middle-class Jewish family. His father was a successful lawyer, and like Oppenheimer, Weisskopf grew up surrounded by high culture. So he was exposed to all the rich cultural offerings of Vienna of the time, concerts, the opera, theater. Weisskopf studied the piano. He had a lifelong love of music. In fact, in his late teens, he seriously considered becoming a professional musician. And when he went on, his interest in science eventually outweighed that for professional purposes. And so he then had a successful scientific training, if you will, with all the great names of Europe at the time, all the great scientists. He went to study with Heisenberg in Leipzig, and with Schrödinger in Berlin, and with Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, with Wolfgang Pauli in Zurich, and then back to working with Bohr. So he floated around with each of the great names in physics at the time. And that's not only a result of his talent and his promise, but also the fact that it was hard to get a job. This was the Depression era, and so he could keep taking these short period positions with different people without them making the commitment of a full-time job. And as well, when the Nazis came to power, he was excluded from permanent positions because he was Jewish. So in 1936, he realized that it would be best if he left Europe and came to the United States. That was not so easy to do. In 1936, of course, there were very few positions available in the U.S., and many of the Jewish scientists knew that the Nazi onslaught would be bad for them, and so they were starting to come to the United States and competing very heavily for jobs. So what Weisskopf decided to do is to publish something in nuclear physics, because that was a hot topic. It's not what he happened to be working on at the time, but he realized he would increase his probability of success in getting a position if he did some nuclear physics, and also if he published in English. So he neither knew nuclear physics nor English, but he put them together in short order and published a paper in nuclear physics in English, and that helped him then secure a job in the United States. In early 1943, then, he was invited to come to Los Alamos to be Hans Bethe's deputy, and he was beloved by the experimentalists because he really served as a bridge, if you will, between the theoreticians and the experimentalists. Experimentalists would come, they would ask some kind of a question, and he could translate the theory into something practical that the experimentalists could then use, and as a result, because he had this important bridging responsibility, he was one of the few theorists to witness the Trinity test near Alamogordo. So he was one of the few to witness that test because theorists didn't really need to be there, but he felt a bond with the experimentalists, and they thought that his presence would be helpful. He went on after the war to to work for many years as a professor at MIT, and then he was invited to be the director of the CERN laboratory in Europe, and he was instrumental in bringing CERN to worldwide attention in the early 1960s. He combined these traits of the sentimental and romantic with the rigorous intellectual discipline and judgment needed for a scientist, and as he liked to say, his favorite occupations were Mozart and quantum mechanics. The consultant to the division office, somebody who spent lots of time at the laboratory and was on the books as a consultant, was Johnny von Neumann. He was born in Budapest, also the son of wealthy Jewish parents, and he was a child prodigy. By the age of 6, he was able to exchange jokes in classical Greek. He could memorize telephone directories on sight. It was said that he could divide 2 8-digit numbers in his head when he was 6 years old. At the age of 8, he had mastered calculus, and by the age of 12, he was at the graduate level in mathematics. He once went to a seminar for advanced students in Zurich, and the teacher said that the teacher mentioned that there was a certain theorem that hadn't yet been proved, and it is probably quite difficult to prove. Von Neumann just sat there for about 5 minutes and then raised his hand, went up to the board, and wrote down the proof. And the teacher was forever after intimidated by von Neumann. Von Neumann was interested in many things beyond physics. He had a passion for ancient history, and a professor of Byzantine history once reported that von Neumann had greater expertise on the subject than this professor had. Von Neumann was always very meticulously dressed. You see in photographs of him, he's always wearing a suit and tie, and in fact it's said that he rode down the Grand Canyon on a mule while wearing a 3-piece pinstripe suit. He also was an inveterate reader, but also a bad driver, and part of it is because he combined those two activities simultaneously. He used to read while he was driving. One time he got in an accident, and he said he was proceeding down the road. The trees on the right were passing him in an orderly fashion at 60 miles per hour. Suddenly one of them stepped out in his path. Very colorful individual, known to have he loved to eat and drink. His wife said that he was expert at counting everything except calories. And one time, Otto Frisch, in his memoirs, says that von Neumann was working on the early computers. He was one of the really founding fathers of what we call modern computers. And Frisch said to von Neumann that maybe he should consider using electronic tubes instead of cogs, instead of mechanical cogs for a computer. And von Neumann then spent 5 hours uninterruptedly giving a lecture about computers to Frisch, and they stopped only so that von Neumann could go get a beer at the pub before it closed. They then went back to the lecture room, and he continued for 2 more hours in this nonstop description of how computers could be built and work. Frisch also says that he once saw von Neumann on a bet drink 16 martinis in a row and still stand on his feet and speak lucidly, though somewhat pessimistic in his utterances. Now we start going through some of the group leaders from theoretical division. The first of them, Sir Rudolf Peierls. You can tell from his title that there's a connection to the British Empire. Sir Rudolf Peierls was born in Berlin, and then he ended up at Cambridge University in England, studying on a Rockefeller scholarship. And at that time, Hitler came to power, and Peierls then never went back to the mainland of Europe, and he worked with the British government on their war effort and then subsequently came to the United States as part of what was called the British mission to Los Alamos. He was one of the 20 or so scientists to come to Los Alamos when the United States and Great Britain merged forces on the development of an atomic bomb. In fact, Peierls worked with Frisch in England to develop what's called, quite famously, the Frisch-Peierls Memorandum, which was written to the British government to explain how one might go about building an atomic bomb. And it was very important that he made that memo and started the process in England of the work on a bomb. He was working originally in England, but was excluded from working on the most important war effort in England at the time, which was radar. But it was considered too secret for somebody who was a foreign-born scientist to work on. So because he was excluded from working on radar, he then worked on this concept, which became the atomic bomb. Later in life, he was the pioneer of a concept we know as holes in semiconductors, very important for the functioning of transistors and all electronic circuits. The Frisch-Peierls memo estimated the critical mass of an atomic bomb to be in the neighborhood of pounds rather than tons, and that was critical for making a practical weapon. When the United States started its program on atomic bombs in parallel, but sort of unknown to each other, the estimates at first were that a bomb would maybe fill an entire ship, and you could maybe park one in the harbor and detonate it, but nobody envisioned that you could put something into an airplane and drop it as a bomb until the two efforts were combined. So that was really a direct result of Peierls' calculations. I'll just go on to mention his sense of humor briefly. While he was studying at Cambridge under his Rockefeller scholarship, he was told that he had an obligation to inform the Rockefeller Foundation of the results of his work, so he sent them a copy of his daughter's birth announcement, and apparently they were not amused by that. The second group leader I wanted to talk about is Bob Serber. Serber breaks the pattern now. He was born in the United States. He was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and he had a very strong leftist Jewish socialist type upbringing. He experienced some discrimination in his career. He was prevented from working in the physics department at Berkeley as a professor because the feeling was one Jew on the faculty was enough. But he knew Oppenheimer quite well, and even though he went to work with Oppenheimer, he was unable to get a job at Berkeley, so he went to the University of Illinois. But Oppenheimer brought him to the laboratory as sort of his right-hand man at the time, somebody who knew everything there was to know about what would go into making a bomb. And the story was that people would come to Los Alamos and Serber would teach them everything that Oppenheimer understood about how bombs might work. Those lectures were subsequently declassified and have been published in something called the Los Alamos Primer by Bob Serber, and you can read that book today. This is how Serber would introduce scientists to what this secret project was all about. When he would give these lectures, this is a description of him by somebody who was there. A lean, dark, inconspicuous wisp of a man, Serber hated dramatics. While talking, he stumbled continually over his words and swallowed impatiently as though he had dust from the mesa lodged in his throat, but felt his subject too trivial to justify a sip of water. Nevertheless, he held his audience. He wasn't much of a speaker, but for ammunition he had everything Oppenheimer's theoretical group had uncovered during the last year. He knew it all cold, and that was all he cared about. Really an important individual. His wife, I'll just mention as an aside, his wife was the only woman to head a technical section at the laboratory. She was a librarian, and Oppenheimer recognized that scientists would need a technical library, and so he employed her to be the first head of the technical library. The next group leader I want to talk about is possibly the most colorful individual to the general public. This is Richard Feynman. Feynman became quite famous, as you probably know, from his work on understanding the Challenger accident late in his life. But Feynman's early days were marked again by sort of prodigy-level science abilities. And as I say, he hadn't even turned 27 at the time he was heading a group at Los Alamos. His mother said that he couldn't decide whether he wanted to be a comedian or a scientist, so he combined the two options. He experienced some discrimination. He was accepted at Princeton for graduate school, but there was a statement by the admissions board that they did have to limit the number of Jews. They also said that they had never seen anyone whose scores were so good in math and physics, and at the same time they had never seen anybody whose scores on the general aptitude tests were so low in history and English. And I think Feynman cultivated that sort of low-class, rough and tumble type personality. He is the subject of many wonderful stories. I'll share just a few of them with you. He says in his own words that when he was invited to come to Los Alamos, and this was obviously a secret mission, he says, we were told to be very careful not to buy our train ticket in Princeton, for example, because Princeton was a very small station, and if everybody bought train tickets to Albuquerque, New Mexico in Princeton, somebody would be suspicious that there was something up. So everybody bought their tickets somewhere else, except me, because I figured if everybody bought their tickets somewhere else, so he bought his in Princeton. He went to the train station and said, I want to go to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the man says, oh, so all this stuff is for you. We had been shipping out crates full of counters and equipment for weeks and expecting that they didn't notice the address was Albuquerque, so at least I explained why it was that they were shipping all those crates. I was going to Albuquerque. Feynman's wife, whom he met early in his life, came out to New Mexico with him, but she was already dying of tuberculosis, and so Oppenheimer arranged for her to be in the hospital in Albuquerque. Feynman used to make trips down from Los Alamos to Albuquerque to visit her, but when he came to Los Alamos, he was told, again in his own words, that there would be 2 people in a room, but that would only be temporary. Every 2 rooms would share a bathroom, and there would be double-decker bunks in each room. And Feynman says, I didn't want 2 people in my room. So the night I got there, nobody else was there. I decided to try to keep the room to myself. My wife was sick with TB in Albuquerque, but I had some boxes of stuff of hers. So I took out a little nightgown, opened the top bunk, and threw the nightgown carelessly on it. I took out some slippers, and I threw some powder on the floor in the bathroom. I made it look like somebody else was there. Okay, so what happened? Well, it's supposed to be a men's dormitory. So I came home that night, and my pajamas were folded nicely and put under the pillow at the bottom. My slippers were put nicely at the bottom of the bed. The lady's nightgown was nicely folded on the pillow. The bed is all fixed up and made. The slippers are put down nicely. The powder is cleaned from the bathroom, and nobody's sleeping in the upper bed. Next night, the same thing. When I wake up, I rumple up the top bed, I throw the nightgown on it sloppily, scatter the powder in the bathroom, and so on. And after 4 nights of this, when everybody was settled into their rooms, I was set because they didn't put a second person in my room. So I thought that was a wonderful trick of Feynman's. He also used to defy the censors by putting letters in code to his wife, and then he was told he had to supply the code so that they could figure out what he was actually writing to his wife. Just a wonderful, wonderful character. He went on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1965, and I had the privilege of taking a full-year class from him at Caltech when I was an undergraduate. The next group leader I want to mention is Joe Hirschfelder. I had alluded to him from his reminiscences earlier. He also was born in the United States, and the research I've done suggests that he was Jewish, but I have no direct evidence of that. I know that his grandfather and his father, well, his grandfather certainly was Jewish. There's an article about him in the Jewish Encyclopedia of 1905. His grandfather lived in Oakland, California, and was emigrated from, well, the great-grandparents emigrated from Germany to California in 1843. And then his grandfather and his father became medical doctors, and so Joe grew up with some science background, if you will. He went on to become one of the leading figures in theoretical chemistry for an enormous period of time. Between 1935 and 1990, he really was the giant of theoretical chemistry, and he used to give lectures when he was at the University of Wisconsin, where I think he spent most of his career, and students would get a kick out of comments like, Hans Bethe was telling me such and such, or Johnny von Neumann suggested to me such and such, because he really had rubbed elbows with all the greats. He witnessed the test near Alamogordo, and in his own words, he says, all of a sudden the night turned into day, the chill turned into warmth, the fireball gradually turned from white to yellow to red as it grew in size and climbed into the sky, and the air filled with a purple glow, just as though we were surrounded by an aurora borealis. Quite a beautiful turn of phrase. The last of the group leaders I want to mention is George Placzek. Placzek was also born in Europe, in Brno, Moravia, in what is now the Czech Republic, but was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was born in what we would call Bohemia, and I think he was Bohemian in all senses of that word. He really lived kind of an itinerant life, bouncing from one place to another. He was apparently the only citizen of Czechoslovakia to take part in the Manhattan Project. And his grandfather was a rabbi, and also had a scientific interest. His grandfather, Placzek's grandfather, was a correspondent with Charles Darwin and had a close friendship with Gregor Mendel. And those were major influences on Placzek's life in science, to go on in science. So I just want to share with you one story about Placzek, and this comes from the memoirs of Vicky Weisskopf. This was back well before the Manhattan Project, back when they were both in Europe, and it says that Placzek was invited to the USSR at the same time that Weisskopf was invited, so they planned to travel together. Placzek made a list of things that were hard to get in the USSR to bring to their Soviet friends. Among many other items, he decided to include a large quantity of condoms. Since he had a very generous nature, he bought about 1,000 of them, and the two of them decided to assemble all the goods in Weisskopf's apartment, and on the appointed day, Placzek arrived with his arms loaded with packages. He began to unpack the boxes of chocolate, slide rules, tissues, and soaps he had bought. Then he suddenly stopped. He hit his forehead with the palm of his hand, and he said, "The Copenhagen taxi trade is going to die out." We couldn't imagine what he meant. "I forgot the box with the condoms in the taxi," he finally told us, and he left to buy another large batch. Very interesting character. So I do want to go on to mention the other two future Nobel Prize winners from theoretical division at that time. They were not group leaders, but they went on to win Nobel Prizes. One of them was Fred Reines. Fred Reines was born in New Jersey. He was the son of Jewish immigrants from Russia, and he was a relative of quite a famous rabbi, Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Reines. And in his autobiographical remarks given to the Nobel Prize Committee, Reines says, "The first stirrings of interest in science that I remember occurred during a moment of boredom at Hebrew school, when, looking out of the window at twilight through a hand curled to simulate a telescope, I noticed something peculiar about the light. It was the phenomenon of diffraction. That began for me a fascination with light. So there was something useful that came out of Hebrew school. Had he not been bored, he might not have gotten so interested in diffraction. Reines went on to do his research at Los Alamos for many years after the war, and it was that research that led to his experimental evidence for the existence of a very elusive particle called the neutrino, and that's what he was awarded the Nobel Prize for some years later. The other future Nobel Prize winner had quite a different story. This was Roy Glauber. To the best of my knowledge, he's still alive today, and that's because he was so young when he came to Los Alamos. He had finished 2 years of college at Harvard. At the age of 18, he was done with 2 years of college, and he had already gotten into the graduate classes, and he was recruited to come to Los Alamos to help out in theoretical division at the age of 18. And he said in his Nobel Prize speech that resuming the life of an undergraduate at Harvard early in 1946 proved surprisingly difficult, even though I needed only a few credits to graduate. Having had a team of assistants to do calculations for me at Los Alamos didn't make it any easier, I found, to do my own homework back at school, particularly when I felt I had moved beyond all that. And he was awarded the Nobel Prize for the quantum theory of optical coherence. One last individual from theoretical division caught my attention. I was looking at the people who were in the group that Richard Feynman led. It was a small group with only less than half a dozen people, I think. But one of the names was Murray Peskin, or Peskin M, and I tracked down that was Murray Peskin, and it sounded like a Jewish name, so I thought I would look into it. Murray Peskin was not a scientist brought to work on the project, but rather he was a soldier, and he was in what was called the SED, or Special Engineering Detachment. These were soldiers who had some scientific background and could assist in the project, but I would say they were probably more the crank turners than the inspiration for the ideas. And Peskin was there in the service at Los Alamos. He was 19 years old when he arrived in Los Alamos in 1944, and when I was able to track down who this was, I found a phone number for him at Argonne National Laboratory in Chicago, where he worked for many years, and I called him up and I got some of his accounts of life, Jewish life, if you will, at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. He grew up in a very assimilated home, he told me. They were Reform Jews. He had a perfunctory bar mitzvah, no further involvement with his Judaism as he was growing up. And he said that he never heard a Jewish joke or a word of Yiddish in theoretical division. Now, he may have missed some of what was going on, but I think that probably was the case because these were all quite assimilated Jews that he was surrounded by. He did tell me that he was fortunate to end up in Feynman's group. He told the head of the group he was assigned to that maybe they could speed up the calculations if they knew what it was they were trying to calculate. And he was told, I can't tell you because you don't have the right security clearance. And Peskin said, well, how do I get the right security clearance? And the guy said, I don't know, I guess we just apply for it. So he ended up getting a security clearance. Once he knew what they were working on, he said he wasn't able to speed the calculations up at all. But then Feynman said, we need somebody who can help out, but the person has to have a clearance. And Peskin was the only one who had the clearance, so he ended up working in Feynman's group till the end of the war. Quite an interesting, fortunate turn of events. Subsequent to my assembling these materials, I did want to share that Peskin died just this last September 20th at the age of 92. So September 20th, 2017, he passed away. So having gone through fairly quickly the people in theoretical division, I did want to pay homage to some of the important Jewish scientists who were not in theoretical division. So I start with a photograph of what the conditions were like for experimentalists. And here you see not an elegant or sophisticated building. It looks like a log cabin with wooden benches and equipment, and that was the experimental setup that was used by this Jewish individual, Emilio Segre. Segre was born in Tivoli outside of Rome, and Segre did a very important experiment in this log cabin as part of the Los Alamos Manhattan Project, where he proved that plutonium could not be used in a gun-assembled device. That was a major discovery, and one that caused the entire laboratory to go into an uproar. General Groves said, we have to be able to make a bomb with plutonium. We've spent billions of dollars to generate plutonium. Don't tell me you can't make a bomb with that. And so this implosion scheme that had been just a back burner idea suddenly became a very important endeavor at the laboratory. The laboratory reorganized, one of the first of many reorganizations at the laboratory, but again, theoretical division stayed theoretical division. But it was really Segre's experiment that led to that change. So he found in April of 1944 that this gun-type assembly would not work with plutonium. Segre's grandfather was the architect of the very famous Florence Synagogue, a beautiful synagogue in the city of Florence. And Segre said that he was not religious, and his family grew up outside of Rome, but he says that if he was in Florence during some religious festivity, he would participate in it with his uncle and his cousins, and he once was in Florence during Yom Kippur when he was about 12 years old. On that solemn holiday, he tells us one is supposed to fast for 24 hours, so they all went to the synagogue in the morning, and around noon, Segre left because he was feeling hungry, and he went to a restaurant to eat, and lo and behold, he found his uncle there. Segre thought his uncle would pay for his lunch, but his uncle was not pleased to see him and did not appreciate God's joke. Segre went on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics also for his discovery of a particle called the antiproton, so he went on to have quite an illustrious career. I just want to share also a story with you about his becoming a U.S. citizen while he was at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. He says, we had applied for citizenship in 1939, and after the statutory period, an examiner came to question us. He could not enter Los Alamos, so the examination took place in a guard post at the gate. The examiner started with Segre's wife, Elfrida, and Macmillan, who was another scientist at the project who also went on to win the Nobel Prize. Macmillan served as the witness. So the examiner asked Segre's wife, do you believe in polygamy? And she said no. That was the end of her test. Then he went on to turn to Segre, but it was about noon, and he said, I'm sure that a person like you has studied the Constitution and has informed himself in detail about this. And Segre said, yes, that's true, and that was the end of the exam. So a few weeks later, they were sworn in at the Superior Court in Albuquerque. They were proclaimed citizens of the United States, and they went back to Los Alamos. And then a few days later, the judge, who was quite apologetic and embarrassed, said that they had to pause the citizenship decree because there was an election coming up, a presidential election. And it turns out that there was a law that said you can't have somebody become a citizen just before an election. Presumably there might be some possibility of tainting the election results. So the judge said, just take the nullification in stride, don't raise a fuss, and I'll remake you a citizen immediately after the election. So I agreed, but I said during this interim period, before I became a citizen the second time, I had signed some patent affidavits, and I swore that I was a citizen. And the patent lawyer said, you know, if a problem ever comes up about that, we'll ask the Supreme Court. And apparently no problems ever came up about that. So Segre went on, as I say, to a very important career, subsequently winning the Nobel Prize. Here is a picture of another experimental setup, also not very elegant. You can see snow on the ground, and you can see people pulling a very heavy object. This was the largest radioactive source that had ever been created at that time. It was a kilocurie source of radiolanthanum, and this was used in an experiment that was devised by Bruno Rossi, whom I'll speak about momentarily, but the experiment involved trying to study the symmetry of the implosion once it was realized that the implosion system would be needed for a plutonium bomb. And it was Rossi's team who developed this method of studying the symmetry of the implosion to see if the high explosives were really able to drive a symmetric implosion and therefore a working plutonium bomb. So Bruno Rossi was born in Venice, another Italian Jewish scientist. His father was an electrical engineer who participated in the electrification of Venice, and Rossi experienced discrimination by being dismissed from his professorship in Padua in September of 1938 as a result of the Nazis' rule. He went on to have a very important role in space physics research after the war, but his important part for the purposes of the Manhattan Project really was this so-called Rala experiment using the radioactive lanthanide source. I will say he must have been a brilliant experimentalist, because when I came to the laboratory, people were still using equipment that was designed by him, and this is many years later. The next individual, George Kistiakowsky, a little bit older than some of the others. You can see that he was born in 1900, so he was about 44 in 1944. He fled Kiev during the Russian Revolution and then studied in Germany and came to the United States quite early on in 1926. And he went on in the United States to become the leading expert on explosives. And so during the war, he had a very important job with the Office of Strategic Services, who asked him to develop an edible incendiary. This was a way to help the Chinese out, to aid them in their resistance against the Japanese. So Kistiakowsky mixed an explosive with regular baking flour, and he created a compound that looked totally unsuspicious. It looked like something you could use to bake muffins or cakes with, and in fact it could be used for that. It was called Aunt Jemima, named after a popular American brand of pancake flour. There were eventually 15 tons of Aunt Jemima that were used during the war, and none of them was ever discovered by the Japanese. The Chinese were able to smuggle this so-called baking flour across the lines and to use it to make explosives. When he was brought to Los Alamos, it's because of this need to use explosives to drive the plutonium implosion, and Kistiakowsky had a singularly important role in spearheading that experimental effort to design explosives that would work with plutonium. He used his explosives knowledge as well to create a ski area in Los Alamos by putting rings of explosives around trees and felling the trees by blowing them up to create a slope. I earlier mentioned the Frisch-Peierls memo, so I want to now just speak a little bit about Otto Frisch. Otto Frisch was the nephew of one of the great female physicists of the modern era, Lise Meitner. In some sense, she was robbed of the Nobel Prize, but she, with her nephew Otto Frisch, were the ones to explain that a certain set of experiments that had been conducted were actually causing uranium atoms to break apart, and it was Frisch who coined the word fission. He's the one who said that it was like the biological process of a cell going into fission and splitting apart, and that's what we now call the process for uranium nuclei to split apart. Frisch was the son of a painter and a concert pianist, and he was talented at both of those, but it was his aunt's love of physics that he really inherited, and he went on to become a great physicist. I'll just mention that when he came to the United States, this was in mid-1939, I believe he left, actually in mid-1939, he left Denmark for a short trip to Birmingham, to England, and then he got trapped in England, so he was part of the British mission. He came over with the British mission and came to the United States to work on the Manhattan Project. When he came to the United States, he landed in Virginia on his way to Los Alamos, and he saw a fruit stand with pyramids of oranges illuminated by acetylene flares, and he started laughing because he'd been living under blackout and ration conditions in England, and suddenly to see all this fruit and to see things so lit up was just completely unusual for him. He also had a very lively social life, but he was quite absent-minded, and one time at Los Alamos, he had to have an announcement made over the paging system. Will the person who invited Otto Frisch to dinner please let him know who you are? I always liked that story. Otto Frisch had one of these SEDs assigned to him, one of these soldiers, by the name of J. Wexler. And J. Wexler was a mainstay of the Los Alamos Jewish community for decades. So we got to hear some stories about Otto Frisch directly from J. Wexler, who worked with him. A couple other individuals, Stan Ulam, who spent much of his research career at the laboratory as well as coming to the laboratory to work during the Manhattan era. Stan Ulam, born in what was Poland, and he was the one who went on to develop what we call the Monte Carlo method, sort of a statistical method for solving math and physics problems. And he came up with that name for it because he had an uncle who just had to go to Monte Carlo to gamble, and so he dubbed this statistical approach the Monte Carlo method, and that name has stuck to this day. Frisch, whom I just spoke about, remembered Ulam as, quote, a brilliant Polish topologist with a charming French wife, and he once told me that he was a pure mathematician who had sunk so low that his latest paper actually contained numbers with decimal points, if you can believe it. Ulam worked closely with Teller, and that's the next individual here, Edward Teller, born in Budapest. Teller had quite a difficult personality. He was irked that he was not selected to lead theoretical division, and so he ended up, after working in theoretical division for some time, getting shunted off to work in his own organization. He was very difficult to work with, and his focus was really not so much on the atomic bomb, but it was on the hydrogen bomb. He's sometimes referred to as the father of the hydrogen bomb, and he is considered to be at least one of the inspirations for the character Dr. Strangelove in the 1964 movie. I believe the last person second to the last person I'm going to mention is I. Rabi. He was not a Los Alamos employee as such, but he was a frequent consultant to the laboratory. He had already won the Nobel Prize in 1944, so he was quite an eminence, if you will, and he, born in 1998, so a little bit older than everybody else. He came to the United States as a baby. He was raised in New York's Lower East Side, very much an Ashkenazic Jewish story. I really enjoyed reading that he kind of became an atheist early on, but he said as a compromise with his parents for his bar mitzvah speech, which was held at home, he gave a speech in Yiddish about how an electric light works. So you could already see that he was a burgeoning scientist. He studied with the great European scientists from the pre-war era, and then came back to the United States. He was the only Jewish faculty member of Columbia at the time. And really, he had an instrumental role in establishing the United States as a place where people could study physics. In his generation, people had to go study with the greats in Europe, but he started establishing teaching abilities here in the United States. He also had a very important influence on Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer tried to recruit him to come to Los Alamos, and he convinced Oppenheimer that the idea of a military laboratory would never work because scientists need to be civilians, that they need to have openness, and the military environment would not allow that. So the plan that Oppenheimer originally had of everybody being a member of the armed forces, that was scrapped because Rabi said, you'll never be able to attract scientists to come if you make them become military personnel. And then he still didn't come, but he came as a consultant many times. Because he was not really here at Los Alamos during the war, he attended the Trinity test in July of 1945, but he was the last one to be able to place a bet on the yield of the test, and the only number that was still open when he showed up for the test was 18 kilotons, so he bought that ticket, and then he won the bet because the blast came in at about 18.5 kilotons, so he won the pool. Now, in fact, the last individual on the list, kind of a tragic figure, in my opinion, Sir Joseph Rotblat. He was born in Warsaw in 1908, and he was invited to come to Liverpool to work with a very famous physicist, Nobel Prize winner, James Chadwick. Chadwick headed the British mission to Los Alamos, and Rotblat came to Liverpool to work with Chadwick, and he left Warsaw in late 1939, late August 1939. And his wife, Tola, was ill at the time with some flu or something, and the plan was that she would join him a few days later. And of course, September 1st, the war broke out, and so she was trapped behind. And this really was a calamity. All of Joseph Rotblat's desperate efforts to bring her out were unsuccessful, and she later perished in the Holocaust. He never saw her again. This affected him quite deeply for the rest of his life. He never remarried. The usual condition for people to work on the Manhattan Project was they had to become either U.S. citizens or British subjects, and he declined. He had come to England as a citizen from Warsaw, and he never became a British citizen. And when he came to the United States as part of the British mission, he declined, and so they waived the condition. He was probably the only non-U.S. or British citizen who was working on the Manhattan Project. He had very strong reservations about the bomb, and allegedly at a private dinner at the Chadwick's house, he heard General Groves say, of course, the real purpose in making the bomb was to subdue the Soviets. And when he heard that, he decided that he wasn't going to continue working, and he quit the project, and he left Los Alamos. He went on to become a professor of physics at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, Barts, in London, and he worked on medical and biological uses of radiation. He also was a very prominent critic of the nuclear arms race. He was the youngest signatory of the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, and that then turned into the Pugwash conferences. And so Sir Joseph Rotblat was a Nobel Prize winner late in his life, not for physics, not for chemistry, but for peace, for his work in the Russell-Einstein Manifesto and the Pugwash conferences. And he said in his Nobel Prize-winning speech in 1995, above all, remember your humanity. So I think all of these Jews were probably assimilated at some level, but I'm glad to say that Rotblat understood it was important to remain a human being as well. So thank you for your attention.